Welcome to the history of Blacks in education, historically Black colleges and universities, and predominantly white institutions. I'm Suzanne Malveaux, CNN's national correspondent, and with me today is our distinguished guest, Dr. Johnnetta B. President and Chair of the Board of the National Council of Negro Women and former president of Spelman College and Bennett College, the only two HBCUs dedicated to educating African American women. And Dr. Ruth Simmons, president of Prairie View A&M University, an historic HBCU. She also served formerly as president of both Brown University and Smith College. It's a pleasure to have you both here today with us. You have made such a significant contribution to the field of education. I'd like to start the program off. We have invited VP Franklin, Distinguished Professor Emeritus of History and Education at the University of California, Riverside, to give a short presentation on the history of Blacks in education.
I'm really happy to be a part of the 20th anniversary of the HistoryMakers, and I just wanted to say thank you to Juliana Richardson for this wonderful work that she's done over the last 2 decades. And I'm glad to have been a part of it at the beginning and here again to discuss the historical background for higher education for African Americans. African Americans have placed great faith in education in general and literacy and formal schooling in particular because of their oppressed conditions in American society. For African Americans, education was important in obtaining and maintaining their freedom. As enslaved workers in American society, learning to read and write was illegal, and those who obtained literacy or assisted in literacy training could be severely punished. However, many enslaved children learned to read and write when white children were being taught those skills. And adults often learned to read when they participated in religious services because they were interested in learning to read the Bible. With the outbreak of the Civil War in 1861, self-emancipated African Americans began arriving by the hundreds, by the thousands, behind Union lines. And makeshift classrooms were set up to teach literacy during and following the war. There was a whole race of people trying to learn to read and write. Black and white missionaries came to the South and taught in the freedom schools that were opened in all of the southern states. And following the war and the enfranchisement of African American men through the passage of the 15th Amendment in 1870, one early objective of Black voters was the establishment of public school systems throughout the southern states. The first public schools in many places were the freedom schools that had been opened during the war. When Northern missionaries and teachers began to leave the South, the various religious denominations made arrangements to open normal schools or teacher training institutions where African Americans would be trained as teachers for these newly established public schools. The American Missionary Association, founded in 1846 and supported primarily by the Congregational Church, opened its first school in Hampton, Virginia in 1861, and eventually opened scores of freedom schools and sent over 500 teachers, 2/3 of them women, to work in the South. With the opening of the public schools, the AMA focused on secondary schools, on normal schools, that eventually, many of them became the historically Black colleges and universities. Tougaloo College in Mississippi, Hampton Institute in Virginia, Berea College in Kentucky, Atlanta University in Georgia, and many others. The AMA Church, African Methodist Episcopal Church, took over Wilberforce College in Ohio from the Methodist Episcopal Church in 1863, and it soon served the dual purpose of training teachers and educating ministers for the African Methodist Episcopal Church. Other Black denominations also opened normal schools and seminaries following the war. Howard Normal and Theological Institute was opened in Washington, D.C. by the American Missionary Association in 1866. And General Oliver Otis Howard founded the Normal and Preparatory Department in 1867. Howard University's Theological Department was funded by the American Missionary Association beginning in 1870. Currently, the second largest number of historically Black colleges and universities trace their origins to the Second Morrill Act of 1890. The original Morrill Act was passed in 1862, and called for the opening of land-grant colleges in every state for agricultural and mechanical education, funded by the federal government through the sale of land in the Western Territories expropriated from the native population. The Second Morrill Act in 1890 called on states with dual systems of education, one for whites, one for Blacks, to open or designate one educational institution for whites as the land-grant college and one institution for Blacks as the Black land-grant college. Eventually, the land-grant colleges for whites became agricultural and engineering schools, Texas A&M, Alabama A&M, Penn State University, University of Arkansas, Purdue University. The land-grant colleges for African Americans in the South, however, were victimized by the separate and unequal funding practices in the Southern states and only became teacher training institutions to provide elementary and secondary school teachers for the separate Black public schools in those states, such as Kentucky State University, Southern University in Louisiana, Alcorn State in Mississippi, North Carolina A&T, and others. While a small number of African Americans enrolled at predominantly white colleges and universities beginning in the antebellum period, most college-educated African Americans before 1960 received their undergraduate training and degrees from historically Black colleges. Professional training in law, medicine, educational administration, and other fields was limited for African Americans in the South. For example, you really only had Howard University Law School and Medical School and Meharry Medical School, and they tended to educate the largest numbers. Most Southern Black students had to leave the region for professional and advanced graduate training, sometimes paid for by the Southern state governments. In the years leading up to the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education decision, small numbers of African Americans began to enroll in historically white colleges and universities. And after 1970, the majority of African Americans receiving higher education were enrolled at predominantly white institutions. Nevertheless, up until very recently, the largest number of African Americans receiving undergraduate and graduate degrees received them from the historically Black colleges and universities. As graduates of and administrators at historically Black colleges and predominantly white colleges, the HistoryMakers, Dr. Ruth Simmons and Dr. Johnnetta B, their experiences provide unique insights in the history of African American higher education in the 20th and early 21st centuries.
Thank you, VP, for your historical insights. Really appreciate it. Very helpful to open the discussion. I want to turn our attention to the panelists. And first of all, I just want to thank you for joining us. It is such an honor to be with you both. I come from a family of educators. My mother was a former Head Start teacher and Xavier grad. My father, a former dean of Howard University's medical school. I can appreciate the value of education instilled in me from early on. When they both insisted, they said to me, you can do anything you put your mind to, and don't bring anything home less than a B. So I got that. I got those lessons early. With that, I want to get started here to both of you. Just this historic moment. What are your thoughts? Seeing a graduate of an HBCU assume the vice presidency of the United States. I know people at Howard are just cheering. Dr. Simmons.
Well, I've said before, first of all, Suzanne and Johnnetta, it's a great pleasure to be with you and to be able to have this conversation. Thank you very much for inviting me. Of course, I like to say with any first that they're a bit of an aberration, because it should be normal for someone like Kamala Harris to step into this role, or any other role for that matter. And so the fact that we have to celebrate first it's just one more indication of how slowly our advancement continues to be. We should expect this. Our children should expect that they can ascend to these kinds of positions. There shouldn't be any question of that. But when we celebrate so fiercely that we have made it to that point, it only reinforces the fact that we're still held back by the structures that created the unequal situation that we live with.
Dr. Cole.
Well, I am going to echo words from my dearest sister friend, the Sister President Ruth Simmons, in saying it's a joy to be here. And thank you, Suzanne, for facilitating what I know is going to be a really good conversation. And of course, I must say, happy anniversary. It's the 20th anniversary of the HistoryMakers. And so to you, Sister Founder, Sister Executive Director, Juliana Richardson, thank you. Thank you for all of this extraordinary work that you and your colleagues continue to do. Well, when it happened, when finally a woman, a Black woman, a woman of South Asian descent was on the ticket and indeed will be the vice president of a major party and of our country, I jumped for joy. And yet, like Ruth Simmons, I did have to stop and say, why did it take so long? On the other hand, I appreciate, I feel fulfilled in a sense, because I am a Black woman. In my lifetime, and it's been a long one, I finally saw the presidency of my country in the hands of an African-American man. And now to see the vice presidency of my country in the hands of a Black woman. You know what I've been thinking? I've been thinking of a phrase that we used to use when we were kids. Two kids in some dispute about something. And the one child who finally made the definitive point would say, I told you so. Nah, 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 nah. I told you so. Well, for 401 years, we have been saying the very notion that some people, because they have white skin, are superior to people because they have Black skin? And yeah, we told you so about HBCUs. That these institutions from their very beginning have been graduating stellar leaders, citizens, servants of the people. So yeah, we told you so.
And I know those messages, the I told you so's, where they come from, our childhoods and our parents and our relatives and our big communities and families, that we are raised in a way that we value education. And I'd like for each of you to discuss your very unique childhoods. You're both from very different backgrounds. And Dr. Simmons, I'd like to start with you because you are so eloquent in what you talk about, what your own mother taught you, the lessons about people never feeling inferior, always feeling that you could do anything you put your mind to. Give us a little sense of your background, where you grew up, where you fit in the sibling chain, and how this began. How this began for you.
Oh my. Well, of course, I was born the last child of my parents. 11 children had arrived before me. And so in that sense, in terms of birth order, I was the least significant person in the family for a long time because I was the youngest. My parents were sharecroppers at the time that I was born in Grapeland, Texas. And it was a hard scrabble life. Let's face it, sharecroppers had, this what is called an extension of slavery, was a pretty mean life. But I was quite blessed to have wonderful parents, parents who had an 8th grade education, and who protected us at a very dangerous time. They protected us by telling us how to live in a sometimes violent world in which, for no reason other than the fact that we were Black, could result in our harm. And so we had very strict guidelines as to how to protect ourselves. And I often say the great thing they did for us, 12 children, is that we all lived to adulthood. And that says a lot. That was quite an accomplishment for them. But in our family, the most important thing was to survive. It was to learn how to be in a world that was hostile. But even in that context, my mother taught us never to feel superior to other people, to be kind, to be concerned about others, but also never to think of ourselves as less than another human being. And so I'm very grateful to her for that. But there was no, in a sense, aspiration within my family to get an education because that was such a far-fetched notion, really, at the time. Occasionally, we were able to get to school, but frankly, bringing in crops was far more important to our survival than going to school. But imagine when I did get to school eventually and find in the schoolroom an incredibly engaged teacher who started to give me a sense of the possibilities for learning. And I always attribute that, my interest in learning, to Miss Ida Mae Henderson, my 1st grade teacher, who imbued in me the notion that my mind could be expanded in myriad ways. And that furthermore, for the first time in my life, somebody told me I was smart. And that was very exciting to me. So that's where my journey started in education, at the hands of a teacher who knew how to encourage me, who knew how to open up the world of learning to me, and who knew how to say to me, no matter what's happening out there, you matter, you're smart, you're going to go someplace. So education often for our children across time has been as much about that encouragement as anything else, helping our young people to understand their capacity in a world in which they're constantly given signs that they don't matter, that they're not smart, that they can't go anywhere.
I'm sorry. And Dr. Simmons, I know too that when you graduated from the top of your class, and that you, in a sense, took this notion, right? I mean, this hope, this upbringing that you had of not being unworthy, but exploring outside of the United States. Where can I go? Where can I explore to see where a different model, perhaps, of how Blacks are treated? Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, I had this idea. The first time I ever left home, actually, was when I went off to college at Dillard University in New Orleans. And I had this idea that I knew something was wrong with our country, that the way that people were treated, that had to be an aberration somehow. And so the first opportunity that I had to go outside of the country, to look back at my own country, to assess what was going on, was an opportunity to go to Mexico to study Spanish. And at the end of my freshman year, I got on a bus, to the horror of my family. I got on a bus alone from Texas and rode into Mexico, to Saltillo, Mexico, where I lived with a Mexican family and I studied Spanish. And that was the beginning of a journey for me, a lifetime journey, to know more about the world and to be able to judge fairly what's happening in my own country on the basis of what I see elsewhere.
And I'd like to go to Dr. Cole. Your experience, it's really extraordinary when you read about it and you hear about it and you speak it so eloquently about it, about your great-grandfather and the influence that he had as you grew up in Jacksonville, Florida. So paint a picture for us, if you will, what he was like and what he demanded of you.
Well, I grew up in those horrific days of legal racial discrimination. My life was ordered once I walked out of my home by signs and by notions that somehow, no matter what I did, I would never be equal to those who could drink from the whitewater fountain, go to parks, go to museums. I grew up in the segregated South. I even remember a sign in a park that said, "No Jews, no Negroes, no dogs allowed." But inside of my home and in the safety and the warmth of my community, I was told that I could do whatever I set my mind to do. But I had to have a good education. And secondly, I had to work against that horrific system of segregation. I grew up, obviously, Black. I grew up a girl, but I did not grow up poor. I grew up the great-granddaughter of Abraham Lincoln Lewis. Like many African-American men born in and around 1865, he was named after the so-called Great Emancipator. He never used that name, though. He wanted to be referred to as A.L. Lewis. A.L. Lewis had a tough life. He was born in 1865. He was born of parents who had been enslaved. But he had a drive that was amazing. And with only a 6th grade education, he went on to found, with 6 other Black men, an insurance company. This was 1901. It wasn't the first Black insurance company. It was the first insurance company in the state of Florida. A.L. Lewis became Florida's first Black millionaire. So, and by the way, my mom and my dad were constantly reminding us, myself, my older sister, my younger brother, that's your great-grandfather. We're not rich. But what it meant to be the great-granddaughter of A.L. Lewis was that you know what? Class never trumped race. It didn't matter. I mean, sure, there were certain accommodations, but it ultimately didn't matter. And race is still unable to trump in our country.
And with that,
So,
Dr. Oh, I'm sorry.
I grew up, forgive me. I just wanted to tell this one little bit. A.L. Lewis was a very religious person. And so after church, and it seemed to last all day long, Mount Olive AME Church seemed to last to a kid forever. But at the end, my sister and I got to go to A.L. Lewis's home. And every Sunday, we did that as little ones. And every Sunday, he would remind us we could only play 2 games, regular school or Sunday school. And we would play, my sister and I. My brother is much younger than I. And at a certain point, he would come by and he would say, "Are you ready for the test?" And we'd say, "Yes, Fafa." That's what we called him. And he would say, "What are the 3 B's that are important in your life?" And we would recite the Bible, the school book, and the bank book. The notion of education for a man that only had a 6th grade education was that it was the ticket for an individual and a people to a better life. And A.L. Lewis, Suzanne, I knew I said only this little bit, but you got to have one little bit more.
Please come.
A.L. Lewis had a close friend. Her name was Dr. Mary McLeod Bethune. And through my great-grandfather, I actually would often get to go to Daytona Beach with my mom and my sister. And if she was on campus, my sister and I would go into the office of the legendary Dr. Mary McLeod Bethune. So if I had done something with my life, A.L. Lewis and Dr. Mary McLeod Bethune, they're going to come down from glory and haunt me.
But that's exactly what I was wondering, is like, what is the impact? I mean, that you had, even at the dinner table with your great-grandfather, Bethune, and even in your young adulthood with Dorothy Height. I mean, you had people who were mentors and heroes who were at your dinner table at some point. You had first access to those people. How did that impact who you became as an educator?
Very strong influences. Let me also say that my parents were atypical. And this will be a big plug for HBCUs. My parents each graduated from college. My mother went to Morris Brown as a high school student. She then went to Wilberforce College, now Wilberforce University. My father went to Knoxville College in Knoxville, Tennessee. So again, I would have to be ashamed of myself. I'd have to divorce myself if I hadn't taken all of that influence and done something with it.
And that influence that brought you from Fisk, you graduated at 15 years old, brought you to Fisk and then to Oberlin. Talk about that transition.
Well, I had these pushy Black parents who believed in education like it said the devil believes in sin. And you know, that's a lot of belief. So one day I was in the 11th grade and they said to me, Johnnetta, you will go downtown tomorrow. You'll take a test. If you pass, you go to Fisk University. I didn't want to go to Fisk University. I wanted to be with my friends. I wanted to go to my senior year in high school. But like a good, obedient Black girl, I went downtown and took the test. And stupidly, rather than failing the test, which I could have done, I went and, well, Ruth, you would have done the same thing, so don't laugh at me. Okay, I checked all the right boxes and off I went to Fisk University at age 15 in an early entrance program.
And you transferred to Oberlin. Can you tell us why?
It's a sad story why, Suzanne. The why is that I was my daddy's baby girl. And my dad passed that year. I was traumatized. And even though Fisk was like, it was like being dropped into an intellectual and artistic heaven, but I was traumatized. And so my mom and my sister talked me into going to Oberlin on an exchange program. My sister was a double major in voice and piano at the conservatory. I needed to be near family. And while there, I discovered this thing, this field, this discipline called anthropology, which I couldn't even pronounce hardly. And I stayed at Oberlin in large measure because I had discovered a discipline, very much as Ruth had discovered languages and culture as a way of understanding the world and yourself.
And you would take that to earn multiple degrees as well, advanced degrees, a PhD, as well as a master's. Dr. Simmons, you attended the HBCU of Dillard University in New Orleans, and then you were accepted to Harvard University for graduate school, where you received your PhD in the Romance languages literature in '73. So talk about your path and what led you from the HBCU to then the Romance languages at an Ivy League.
Well, I think after my experience in Mexico, I went back to Dillard, determined to continue learning about other cultures. That seemed so much the key for me. Again, my first year of college, the president of the United States was assassinated. It was not a very happy time in this country. The civil rights movement was burgeoning. There were lots of issues going on, and I was trying to find a way to my country. And so to me, the path to figure out where I belonged and how to deal with the people who hated me was to understand how other countries functioned around the issue of difference. And so I decided to stick with languages. I finished Dillard and received a Fulbright fellowship and went to France to live for a year. Sort of interesting experience to be to learn that the pervasive issue of race crosses boundaries. That was fundamentally something that I eventually learned, because I ended up staying with an elderly lady But I discovered that there was space for me in what they call the Cité Universitaire. And I had a chance to move on to campus, and I wanted to get that experience. And so I told her I would be leaving to go and live on campus. And then all of this racial hatred came out from this woman who was, again, a French woman. But I had that profitable experience in France at a turbulent time in France. The great student revolution of that time was very instructive for me. And essentially, everybody was in the streets. Everybody was protesting, and I got swept up in that as well. And so the impulse of students and of laborers in France to overturn a system, an elitist system in France, was very inspiring to me. I came back from my experience in France and then went on to graduate school at Harvard, determined to continue with my studies in language. That was an interesting and in some ways a cold experience for me, to be perfectly honest with you. Harvard was not really a place at that juncture that was ready for African American students. There were protests there at that juncture. But it's always seemed to me, in the midst of my peregrinations, that the badge of being from an HBCU tended to color people's understanding of what you might be capable of. And so I've always been very aware of that. And so I remember one of my first classes when I got to Harvard. It was a class in Renaissance literature. And as they did in those days, they gave us something called an explication de texte, which is where you actually sit in class and you write an essay in French. And the professor was doing that as a way of understanding what kind of skills we had, because we came from all over the country to this class. And so we completed our work, and the next meeting, he came in and he said that our explications were absolutely terrible, that we needed to do a lot of work in order to get up to speed on doing this French exercise. He said, however, there was one essay that was perfect, and he read it, and it turned out to be mine. And the disappointment on his face when he handed back my essay and acknowledged that it was I who had written it was very clear to me. And in fact, for the rest of that semester, he barely looked at me. He barely spoke to me. He was so disappointed at the idea that I could excel at that level. So that was somewhat my experience at Harvard, going through trying to complete my graduate education, but understanding that I was marked. I was marked as an African American. I was marked as the graduate of an HBCU, and none of my professors thought I would ever go anywhere. In fact, they admitted to that to me later on, that they thought that this was kind of a Pyrrhic exercise, my going to get a PhD in Romance languages and literatures of all things, because Blacks didn't belong in that field.
Do you think
in that field?
I'm sorry. Do you think that has changed? I mean, we've seen kind of an evolution, if you will, of the leadership of presidents like both of you at the helm of HBCUs, and that is becoming more common as it is in predominantly white institutions. Do you think that notion of what the degree means from an HBCU has evolved as we look at the history of education among African Americans?
Not nearly as much as it should have evolved, to be perfectly candid with you, because working with institutions today, this emerges constantly, and of course I can call it out because the experience of leading a major white institution and contrasting that with the way that my students are treated or the way that Prairie View is treated strikes me on a daily basis. And I have to point it out constantly to people that this is not what would happen. This is not the way another institution would be seen. So I'd love to say that we are beyond that, but I don't honestly think that we are. I was having a conversation the other day with the chairman of the board of a very elite institution, who was trying to understand in the current context, were there things that that institution should be doing with regard to African Americans? And I had to point out, well, HBCUs offer a prime opportunity for your institution to partner on research and on internships in any number of different areas, and yet you fail to do that. So it's not what it should be by a long shot.
Dr. Cole, you were instrumental and really at the forefront of establishing some of the nation's first Black Studies programs, both at Washington State and University of Mass Amherst. And there's some institutions now that feel that by having these programs, they've checked a box, if you will. But give us a sense of what did that accomplish, and what were some of the challenges there? Because I know there is a frustration that you've talked about really even HBCUs embracing that ability for Black students to learn about their own history.
Mm-hmm. Well, of course, the 1960s was that period when, in a sense, the Black Power movement that was going on in our country got in cahoots with Black students and Black faculty. It was a time when whatever barriers had been erected between community and campus were challenged. And I did have the experience of being a part of the founding of one of the first Black Studies programs. This was at Washington State University. Ruth has said, and I just have to say what you have said, that it really did take a long time for us as Black scholars to insist on the relevancy of our own experiences. And so to do so in the 1960s as scholars was really a revolutionary moment. It became a revolutionary movement to say that the canon had to be questioned. Now, of course, it's true that across time, there had always been Black scholars who had lifted up the Black experience. And I know we would all think of W.E.B. Du Bois. We would think of Anna Julia Cooper, who insisted that when the Black woman enters, the whole race comes with her. But the notion that Black folk were inferior, which was, of course, what was the explanation and the excuse for enslavement and for long years of systemic racism, that had not been systematically challenged in the academy. And Black Studies as a movement did that. I also remember the day when I had to ask, if this is Black Studies, where are the Black women? And obviously that led me into that interdisciplinary field of women's studies, only to one day ask myself, if this is women's studies, where are the women of color? And so it's a journey that we're still on, a journey where scholarship must challenge any notion of the absence of full humanity on the part of any group of individuals. The Black Studies now has more, shall I use the word stability than it had in the 1960s? Yes. But is it firmly rooted, centered in the academy? My answer would be not enough.
And to both
Well,
of you.
First of all,
Oh,
it's
go
not
ahead.
it's not rooted in historically Black colleges. And one of the
Why do you suppose that's true?
Sorry?
I'm sorry. Why do you suppose that's true, Dr. Simmons, today?
No, I think that it's historical. There's no question that the long journey out of enslavement and segregation traumatized African Americans, and there's no question that we were left with a sense that the grass was greener on the other side. Okay, it's not unlike what used to happen in this country with everything European. American studies came quite late because we privileged European everything over what was native to the United States. And so the maturing out of that colonization, you have to come to a point where you really do fully endorse the fact that you matter as much as everybody else. But our HBCUs sometimes did not understand how important it was for us to be the first to teach jazz, for us to be the first to teach our writers, for us to be the first to teach African American history and courses on race and so forth. And so one of the things that I've done, to some people's dismay, is to insist here at Prairie View that that's the first and most urgent thing that we must do at Prairie View, is we have to teach African American studies. And I think that that will eventually make its way around. And when you don't teach African American studies in an HBCU, you're fundamentally saying that it is not our culture, our history are not as important as the other cultures and histories that we teach on our campuses. And that is never going to be acceptable.
Suzanne, if I may, I'm thinking back to some very special days in my life, 2 years, when Ruth Simmons actually came to Spelman College and served as the provost. And I'm thinking of the struggle at Spelman to turn the study of the great books into a different academic and personal experience for our students. And we call for something called Africa and ADW, Africa, the diaspora, and the world.
Yes.
ADW, Africa, the diaspora, and the world, that would replace what Dr. Beverly Guy Sheftall called the 4 W's in higher education. It was all about what's Western, all about what was womanless, and the 3rd W, all about what was white. And so that struggle on an HBCU to replace the great books of the European experience with Africa, the diaspora in the world, that was a real struggle. And on so many of our HBCUs today, the study of our own experiences is not there.
Can we speak specifically to Black women and the education of Black women? Dr. Cole, you mentioned Lucy Ann Stanton, 1850, received what they called a certificate of literature from Oberlin College, not a bachelor's degree. But the first Black woman to graduate from an American college, it was a certificate of literature, because the female students were confined to what was called at the time the ladies course, designed to be less challenging than the male's bachelor programs. And then we had the process of co-ed education take form. I want specifically for you both to address what Bennett College or Spelman College, what do they provide? Even Smith College, what do they provide uniquely to Black females, what they need in their educational experience to be successful?
I think I'm going to respond, Suzanne, with an experience I had when I was at Spelman. I would hold office hours, and it made the president's office look like a sit-in because you couldn't have an appointment. You just waited your turn. But I will never forget when one Spelman student who had waited a long time, she was almost at the end of the day, walked into my office, and I said to her, "My Spelman sister, I want to ask you something. I looked at your record, and it's really incredibly impressive. I mean, with your grades, with your community service, you could have gone to any institution in America. What made you choose Spelman?" She looked at me and she said, "Well, Dr. Cole, I am going to be an astrophysicist. And I didn't want to have any professor looking at me and saying or implying, 'Honey, are you sure you can do physics?'" That's what happens at a women's college. Nobody looks, well, if that person does, they need to leave. You don't say in any way by words or implication, you cannot do what you have set out to do. There is this expression, I thought about it a lot when Senator Kamala Harris came into the spotlight of our country. On a women's campus, you see the truth in this expression. If you can see one, you can be one. When Ruth Simmons was the president of Smith College, think about the number of young women, and especially young Black women, who said, "If I can see that in Ruth Simmons, I can see that in myself."
Dr. Simmons?
Well, I mean, I can't say it any better than that. It is for women in general, seeing other women performing at the highest level is the greatest source of inspiration in terms of having the wherewithal to stick to your dreams, frankly. And I must say that that when I arrived at Smith College, I was very much aware that the United States had a problem in terms of women in engineering. And I understood so much why women dropped out of engineering and why it was still not a hospitable field for women. And so I called for the creation of an engineering program. And that seemed very important to me because at a women's college, any field should be possible because women need to see that any field is possible for them. And so although Smith was a liberal arts college and faculty really questioned whether it was appropriate at a liberal arts college to have something like engineering, we pushed it through and got it started. And I will tell you that today, when I visit Smith, the women in engineering always approach me and thank me for creating engineering for them, because often they have felt discouraged before coming to Smith about the potential of being able to do engineering at a very high level, and that possibility exists for them in a women's college setting really makes all the difference in the world. My first recognition of what women might be able to do really came when I was a visiting student at Wellesley. I'm the youngest in my family, and my family was a very patriarchal one. My father was very dominant. I have 7 brothers, and none of them thought that the girls in the family were important. And that was the message all the time to us. When I got to Wellesley and I saw Margaret Clapp, who was president of Wellesley, I was just stunned that a woman could be president of a college. Stunned. And so seeing examples obviously makes an enormous difference for young people. I also had the experience of, I think Johnnetta would say that, people thought of me as a very private person. And I didn't talk much about myself. And I think most people along my career path thought that I came from an educated family and a middle-class background and so forth. Right. I just didn't talk about it. And so people didn't know my circumstances. But when I was appointed president of Smith, I think there was a New York Times story that told about my background. And suddenly, these letters started coming from around the country from girls saying, my goodness, if you can do what you're doing, I think maybe I might be able to do it. And so that was a watershed moment for me. I didn't understand fully how important it is for all of us as women to tell our stories because of what it does for the girls who come after us. And so at that point, I decided that I needed to tell my story. And that was, I'm so relieved that I finally got that. But it took me a long time to recognize how important it is.
And Dr. Simmons, to that point, you, in your leadership at these universities, you have really been at the forefront of breaking ground. And one of those examples was at Brown University, when you confronted those from the past and present who are financially supporting the university, the role in the triangular slave trade. I want you to speak to that. I mean, that is something that other institutions will have to grapple with, predominantly white institutions. And what did you call for? Were you successful in addressing that very important issue, as it is a bridge from the historical perspective to now present day when people are asking and demanding reparations?
Well, first of all, again, my greatest teacher, my mother, always said to tell the truth. And when the issue came up of what the ties of Brown University might have been to the transatlantic slave trade, my first thought was, well, that we should pursue this and find out what the truth was. I didn't realize that so many people would be unhappy with the truth, but I found out pretty quickly. In fact, the day that we announced that we were pursuing this issue, a good friend of mine, a scholar, Nellie McKay, called me and said, "Girl, have you lost your mind?" Well, I laughed at the time at Nellie's comment, but she was prescient because she knew that all hell would break loose. Not so much because we were pursuing this issue, because I was a Black woman pursuing it. I didn't know that we had a particularly restricted area in which we could work. I didn't know that as president of an Ivy League university that I was supposed to stay away from certain things. And so I plunged in thinking, let's find out what the truth is and let's disclose that to our alumni and our students and our public. And so it was pretty hairy at the very beginning because the hostility toward me and to the idea that I was doing this was pretty strong, actually. That was a time when public safety sent an officer to guard my house because there was some pretty crazy things happening. Here's the thing. Whatever we say about these special roles, it is true that we are African American, that we're women, that we're African American women. But at the same time, we're expected to carry out our responsibilities as ably as any other person would. So had I been Larry Summers at Harvard, our terms coincided more or less, I wouldn't have worried about whether or not I should undertake a study. And as Ruth Simmons at Brown, I wasn't prepared to ask permission from anybody to do what was necessary. And so we undertook the study. We took longer because the reaction was so strong. And so we meticulously unearthed the facts about what transpired when our university was founded. And what transpired, frankly, is that as a center of shipmaking, Providence was home to the slave trading commerce.
Yes.
And most wealthy people in Providence at the time were somehow entangled with the slave trade. At the same time, they had sent for a minister from Philadelphia to come up and found a Baptist college. And so they were supporting the founding of that college, but with their resources, but they all had profited from slavery. That story had to be told. And it was awkward for some people that I was the one to tell it because I was Black. And because I was Black, surely I had a purpose that was somehow compromised and so on. But we did an excellent study. It's become a model for lots of universities and institutions. And oddly enough, the most difficult thing that I did at Brown has become the thing that I'm best known for at Brown. That singular study that went around the world and really set the terms for how we should investigate our histories and how we should tell the truth finally.
Thank you. Dr. Cole, I want you to share with us, because there have been many periods in our history where during hard economic times or outright discrimination, HBCUs were endangered of closing down or losing their accreditation. And there are actively people who are fighting to this day to make sure that not every institution is Howard University and is supported on a federal level. Give us some recommendations in terms of how do the HBCUs survive? How do they prosper? And how do their collections, their archives, become living documents that go into the future for us to benefit from?
Well, first of all, Suzanne, I want to thank you for acknowledging that this is a struggle. And it is a long struggle for our historically Black colleges and universities. You know, I'm thinking about one of my sheroes, Mary McLeod Bethune, who I referenced earlier, the founder of Bethune-Cookman College, now Bethune-Cookman University, co-founder of UNCF, the United Negro College Fund, and of course, the founder 85 years ago of the National Council of Negro Women. There was a day when Dr. Bethune had to tell all of her students to go into they were called dormitories then, and turn out the lights, because she had been told that the Klan would march on her campus that night. And the students obeyed. And she had instructed that when she gave the signal, the lights were to go on because she would be ringing the bell. And that is what happened. And yes, that night the Klan rode on. But there is a long history of racial terror against folk who want to learn. Today, while we have HBCUs that are making the list of America's best colleges and universities, we also have historically Black colleges and universities that continue to struggle. And if there is anything that I think that we as African American people and as American people must do, it is to take care of the process called education. I mean, it's, you know, President Nelson Mandela told us it is the single most effective way to change the world.
How do we do that specifically? Give us some recommendations, if you can, to support, I mean, those institutions.
2, 1, greater resources, which need to come from ourselves, especially our alums, our alumni and the alumni. We've got to take care of our own institutions. But resources must come from outside of our institutions. And then secondly, I would say, constant reinvention. Because we have taught in a given way back in the day, is no reason that we cannot learn to teach the fundamental notions, but in a way that is relevant to today. And so resources and constant reinvention would be the 2 things I would call for solidifying our HBCUs, because certainly we said this when I was in the presidencies. If historically Black colleges and universities did not exist, we would have to invent them. Because look what they do in terms of creating a pathway for African Americans, and therefore a pathway toward a better America.
And how do we preserve the archival collections of those institutions that promote such a rich history in our community?
Well, first of all, we need to give our thanks to the HistoryMakers for the work that they do as an organization to preserve the history and her story of African American people. And you know, I wait for another one to pop up on my laptop. The HistoryMakers telling me about the history of the picnic or the history of HBCUs. It is an incredible contribution. But what do we do about those most priceless things called papers? The papers of our scholars, where will they go? We have not done a very good job in the HBCU community of preserving the material expressions of our struggles and our triumphs. I can say I am intensely proud to have been a part of the establishment of the archives at Spelman College that now will receive on a continuing basis the papers of outstanding African American women. But there are so many collections that are literally going to cease to exist if we cannot find a way, and by that I mean find the material resources to preserve our own history and her story.
And what can we do? You mentioned the Mary McLeod Bethune and the Klan coming and the preparations for those students. There's a long tradition in history that links HBCUs to social justice movements. And now we see the color of change and Black Lives Matter and during this pandemic. And there are so many challenges for our students. To both of you, what can we do to prepare our young people in terms of citizenship, to be engaged, to vote, to understand how to be impactful at this very, very difficult time of transition?
Well, we've had, sometimes HBCUs have had a very uneasy relationship with activism. We've been through a period in HBCUs where we silenced our students, where we really disciplined them for their activism. There's a story at Prairie View where a young man felt moved to paint a mural that was very explicit about the political environment. And he was arrested and was told that he had to pay damages of $9,000, which he couldn't afford. So when I first arrived at Prairie View, he appealed to me and said, President Simmons, I'm about to go to jail for a couple of years because of the fact that I owe Prairie View $9,000 and because Prairie View has wanted to see me prosecuted for the mural that I did. Well, there's no question that you can't go around painting murals on buildings, for God's sake, which is what I told him right away. That's property damage. But honestly, finding a way to channel his activism would have been a better answer than what we actually did. And so I wrote to the judge and waived the $9,000 and said, please do not put this young man in jail. Activism is very important for our students, especially to learn how to do it, to learn how to be effective at it. So I'll tell you that what I've recently done is create a center at Prairie View, Center for Race and Justice. And the one thing I put in that center was an activist in residence. I want our students to be around people like John Lewis and others who have laid everything on the line in order to advance African Americans. I want them to know the mistakes that they made. I want them to know their journey. That ought to be incorporated on all of our campuses. And we ought to be teaching them how to formulate their plans for activism in a way that doesn't land them in jail, frankly. Or if it does land them in jail, it's for the right reasons. It's worth the risk. We also have a policy project to familiarize our students with the most trenchant issues that are likely to affect their lives and to prepare them for the fact that they are probably going to have to fight for justice for the rest of their lives. That ought not to be a surprise to anybody, but the number of African Americans who graduate from college and go into their professional lives and then are surprised by the fact that they are treated so miserably and so unjustly is appalling to me. why are we not preparing them for the realities of what they might experience? And so what we're trying to do at Prairie View is to bring our students through this center in the course of their time at Prairie View. And then finally, we've said that every student should have to take a course on race and justice. So stoking their activism is not a bad idea. My students often ask me, when I was at Brown, why on earth did I have, for example, the courage to start the study of slavery at Brown? My answer to them is because as an undergraduate student, I was active and vocal, and I learned from my earliest days how to tackle those issues and how to be in people's faces and how to insist that justice prevail. I learned to do that. I became comfortable with it, and all the way up through my career, it never fazed me to have to do that again and again and again. So this comes with practice, and we want our students to have that practice. We are at the seat of voter suppression in our area, and our students have been suing, along with the help of the Legal Defense Fund, for their rights as voters. This is a very virulent time in many ways in terms of voter suppression. Think how long that's been going on in this country, voter suppression. And it's going on this very day in terms of trying to suppress the votes of African Americans in the last presidential election. So if we're not preparing our students to deal with these kinds of issues, we're going to have a long road to justice.
And Dr. Cole, we see another movement afoot as well. These calls for Confederate statues to come down, educational institutions renaming their buildings, recognizing the tremendous accomplishments of and investments made by Black alums. I'm thinking of Melody Hobson's gift to Princeton in naming the business school after her. Both you and Dr. Simmons, you have buildings or programs, as Dr. Simmons mentioned, that are in your names. Tell us, what is the significance or the impact of that to have that be part of a new movement, a new recognition, a turn of history, if you will?
Mm-hmm. Well, once again, we are continuing on a very, very long journey. And I do want to, if I may, Suzanne, just emphasize again the point that Ruth Simmons has made, and that is that our campuses have not always worked with comfort around issues of social justice. And we've got to learn to do that, including having courageous conversations about what you do with statues that glorify a period in American history that was centered in enslavement. We need leaders today like a Willoughby Player at Bennett College, who when the Greensboro Four sat down at that lunch counter and Bennett sisters supported it and went to jail every night. She went to jail, taking homework she had collected from professors. And the next morning, she picked up the homework and passed it out to professors. What a statement of the importance of their social activism, their commitment to justice, but the necessity for their commitment, no less, to their own education. And so more directly to your question, it is a very complex notion that we take down stuff that is being deeply revered by sectors of the American citizenry. But if we don't have conversations about this and reach some decision, in my view, that says there can be a place for these statues that praise by their association racial terror, that praise systemic racism, that praise enslavement. But the place is not in the middle of a college campus. It is in a museum where there needs to be very organized instruction about what that statue means.
I'd like to also address where we are today in terms of this pandemic and the impact that this pandemic clearly is having on the education of African Americans. And we look at the HBCUs. I remember when I attended Howard as a visiting student, I did my senior thesis about Black students who were just visiting, left predominantly white institutions to visit to Howard, ended up staying, transferring out of those institutions because they fell in love with the college, they fell in love with the experience and the community. And so the question really, the obvious question becomes, I mean, how on earth would online learning really duplicate and replicate that kind of experience that is very unique to Black students when they are at HBCUs as we go into a model which looks like very much an online learning model? What is the impact today?
There's no question that much is lost in the current environment where we've all had to switch on a dime to online learning. We know that because our students are insistently telling us about their loss, their sense of loss, not to be able to experience the socialization of the campuses afford, not to be able to grow intellectually in the way that they expect by interacting with others who are going through the same kind of experience, and doing it in a way that is fulsome. We know that a lot of our students, for example, are assessing whether or not it's worth it to be on a college campus because they're not getting the college campus experience. So I think I don't want to minimize the importance of online learning. Let me say this very clearly. For many people, online learning would be an option because it can radically reduce the cost of education, and it can afford many, many people the opportunity to continue their education when they otherwise would not be able to. So if you have a single mother who is working and doesn't have time to go to college, online education can be a useful tool for her. But at the same time, think about what campus experiences mean to us. First of all, for somebody like Johnnetta, for somebody like me, if you ask me whether or not I would have been able to have the journey that I've had if I had experienced my education in a way, I can say resoundingly, no, I would not have. I remember sitting in a class with a music professor, and we were listening to classical music, and we were having to memorize composers and particular pieces of music and so forth, and thinking to myself, isn't this interesting? Black people have produced a lot of music. Why aren't we studying that? So, I mean, that kind of immediate interaction with stimuli on a campus promote ideas. And a lot of the ideas that I've carried forward from all the way through my career have been stimulated by on-campus environments. I'll give you another example. When I was a guest student at Wellesley College, we were one day in classical philosophy class talking about apartheid in South Africa. And everybody had an opinion about it, of course, and all of the students spoke up in horror about the evil of apartheid. But there was a young woman who raised her hand and who spoke up and said, I'm South African. And then she began a spirited defense of apartheid in class. And I like to explain to people that over the course of my time as a student, there are many experiences in classes that I don't recall, but I recall that because the stimulation that you receive in firsthand experiences face to face is of a different order from what you experience simply reading a book, simply being an autodidact or having courses online. And that's what we're giving up if we don't have these experiences. There's one final point I'll make, and that is the difference that it made for me. Okay, so I'm a child of poverty. I had very limited experiences. I did not have the ability to see what the range of people who occupy this earth are like, but for going and living on a campus. And so I once had, when I was president of Brown, a visit from the king and queen of Greece, which they still call themselves. And I had tea with them at my home at Brown. And people asked me, well, how did it feel to have the king and queen for tea? And my response is, well, I was perfectly prepared for that because I went through the experience of being socialized to all of these sorts of experiences because I was on a campus. Our students who come from impoverished backgrounds, from narrow backgrounds, need this more than anything else, frankly. And I would hate for that to be lost. So I hope we can find a way to make online available for those who need that option, but at the same time not destroy the option that many of our students need that really remain the on-campus experience.
Thank you. I would like to open the discussion up now to our education makers, the advisory committee. They advise the history makers in the area of open education. I'm sure they have lots of questions. This committee includes Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, Harvard University Professor of History and African American Studies, Leslie Baskerville, CEO of the National Association for Equal Opportunity in Higher Education, Earl S. Richardson, President Emeritus, Morgan State University, Distinguished Professor and Research Associate, the Honorable Joan M. Prince, Vice Chancellor at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and again, VP Franklin, historical commentator to this program's discussion, and of course, a Distinguished Professor Emeritus of History and Education. So we'd like to open the questions up to our panelists. Our first question will go to Chancellor Prince.
I do have a question, but very short context. First of all, let me just say to Suzanne, excellent moderation. You make us proud, so thank you for that. And to the fabulous, extraordinaire other women that I also see in front of me, my soror, Dr. Johnnetta Cole, and to Dr. Ruth Simmons, who I have not had the opportunity to meet. I need you both to know how proud you make us and how much our heart feels when we see you, even when you don't speak. We know you're there, so thank you. My question is one of those probing ones that we all, it focuses on what we all have heard, but people don't openly like to discuss. And that is the relationship between PWIs and HBCUs. I live in Wisconsin, at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, obviously a PWI. But in speaking with colleagues for years across the nation, I have always tried to counteract that sort of what I call the elitist attitude of some PWIs that HBCUs are less than they are from a research and an academic peer. And that was really the discussion around PWIs for years, if we want to be honest about that. Having said that, then a number of things happened which started to erode and change that thinking, right? Katrina, Hidden Figures, at least they did watch the film, right? Hidden Figures, and understanding that HBCUs produce those in the medical field, attorneys, engineers, mathematicians, astrophysicists. and also understanding that at PWIs, the diversity of the faculty is not there. So now the discussion on many PWIs is, how do we partner with HBCUs? And in some back corners, it's not really about partnering. I think it's about poaching. So my question to you, to both of you, if you would be, what advice would you give to PWIs who seek to partner with HBCUs, particularly around their approach and around their intent? Thank you.
Well, since I'm in the midst of this on a daily basis, let me at least get started, if it's okay with you, Johnnetta.
Please.
I have a mantra that I employ in dealing with leading white institutions, as well as corporations and anybody else who approaches Prairie View about a so-called partnership. And what I say to them is, if you are interested in tokenism and an unequal relationship, go someplace else. And I'm encouraging all of my peers, leaders of HBCUs, to take the same stance. We have all so often in our histories, we have been content with the leavings, and that has to come to an end. We are either good enough, valuable enough to be partners, or we're not. And if we don't think we are good enough, then we shouldn't be in the business. So the first thing that I say to leading institutions, white institutions, is that we are happy to have partners in this effort, but only if you are willing to consider Prairie View to be an equal partner. And that means in decision making, that means in the ways in which you formulate the path forward. One of the things that we're experiencing is white institutions want to partner with Black institutions in order to get a leg up in competitive funding. And so many funding agencies have said very clearly, you cannot hope to be funded unless you have a partner, a minority institution partner. Even the White House initiative says that all of the agencies of the US government must have a relationship with HBCUs. So the pressure for them is that they have to have this relationship. But they often don't feel that they want to share the power in that relationship. So that's number one, is when you approach an HBCU with respect and make sure that your intentions are the right ones, and that is you want partnership and not to continue a paternalistic relationship with an HBCU, which will be insulting at the very least. Secondly, the programs that you offer for our students must, of course, have the same kinds of provisions as the ones that you have for your own students. And so don't say that you're going to have certain programs for your students, but for those HBCU students who are really not, as strong, you're going to do something different. That you shouldn't do under any circumstances. Finally, I would say that the most important thing is not to come with a minimum resources. Here's the reality of the HBCU situation. HBCUs are typically underfunded. That means they don't have the staffs that large white institutions have. And one of the complaints you hear all the time from those institutions is, well, we tried to do this program with this HBCU, but we couldn't, they weren't responsive, and we couldn't get this done, and we couldn't get that. Well, of course you couldn't, because they don't have the staff that you have. So one of the things to factor in as you're trying to start any kind of partnership is to ask the question about staffing. To what extent are you able given your resources, to be able to participate in this partnership? And if you cannot, based on the staffing you have, what can we do to help staff up so that you can participate on an equal basis?
The only thing that I could possibly add to what Ruth Simmons has so forcibly and very effectively suggested is this, that a partnership really is about reciprocity. Otherwise, again, it's paternalism. And so if there is reciprocity, it does seem to me that those who are coming from PWIs have got to do the kind of inner work, the kind of transformation of their own thinking and learning to entertain and ultimately believe that there are things they can learn from HBCUs. It's not a one-way street where the PWIs, out of the generosity of their souls, decide to come and help the poor HBCUs. Historically Black colleges and universities, I think, can teach PWIs an enormous amount about teaching, about the very process of using respect for where a student is as a platform for taking that student to where she can possibly go. Our HBCUs, I think, have an enormous amount to teach about the experience that is outside of the classroom. And my soror, you and I both know that some of that is in the lives of fraternities and sororities on our campuses. But there's something that happens at an HBCU that I think PWIs could well learn. And that is how a college experience can literally affirm who a student is in the process of preparing her for where she is to go.
Thank you both. Our next question is from Ms. Baskerville.
Thank you so very much. I'd like to first thank Juliana Richardson for her tremendous vision, her energy, and her leadership that has brought to us the HistoryMakers and now the world's largest digital archives of African Americans. I'd like to thank you, Suzanne Malveaux, for your exquisite moderating, and my leaders, the presidents of two of NAFIO's institutions, well, the former president in one case and present president in the other, for their enriching and inspiring remarks. I'm always touched deeply, and I stand a little taller because you are my leaders. I'd like to contextualize my question. I note that 40 years ago, when Dr. Mary Frances Berry, one of our other education giants, was the head of the Office for Civil Rights in the United States Department of Education, she responded to a lawsuit that was brought by the National Association for Equal Opportunity in Higher Education, which is the association I'm privileged to represent. And it is the membership and advocacy association of all of the HBCUs and all of the PBIs. We brought litigation, and after years of negotiation back and forth, she settled the case that established the principle that in states that maintain dual higher education systems, one Black and one white, the states must invest in the HBCUs so that their programs were comparable given their missions, their facilities, their salaries, and the like. That was 40 years ago. In the ensuing years, many things have transpired, and some of which have led to the current state where HBCUs are graduating 42% of African Americans in the sciences, technology, engineering, and mathematics, 50% of American public education professionals, 52% of Blacks in agriculture, and the list goes on. HBCUs collectively are punching way above their weight in graduating the growing populations of the country. And yet, in response to a question Suzanne Malveaux put forward about what we can do in the case, because in some cases our institutions are struggling, what we can do is insist that America invests in HBCUs such that it is commensurate with their input and their outcomes. There's a case going on in Maryland today that is looking at that very issue, a case in which the public historically Black colleges sued the state because despite the tremendous outputs and despite the fact that Morgan State University, Bowie State University, University of Maryland East Shore, and Coppin State University are graduating disproportionately more of the growing populations of the states, they're not receiving full funding. And so what I'd like to know from my leader presidents is, would you support the idea of either Congress or the next administration withholding public dollars from those states that fail to invest in public universities such that they are comparable to and competitive with their historically white colleagues?
I'll start. Just from a public policy perspective, that is a very specific prescription. It's not the only one. And so what I support utterly, the idea that states should be forced to fund these institutions appropriately, absolutely. Absolutely. Whether or not that's the right way to do it, I won't comment on because I don't really know, frankly, what would be the right way to approach it. But obviously, this is a continuation of very unjust circumstances that should not be permitted to continue. There's no question about that. So I'm happy to say that in any venue, and I'm happy to say that I think it's the right thing to do to stop underfunding institutions. And there are all kinds of ways that states find a way to do that, by the way. They find a way to do it because of the achievement level of students, right? They find a way to do it because of the disparate conditions, economic conditions, which force students to have a particular path that they think is not something that they approve of. They find lots of reasons not to fund at the appropriate level because they would rank institutions as not achieving in the way that they specifically would like for them to be achieving. And that's a hoax also. So I think there's a lot that has to be disclosed as unjust in terms of the way this funding occurs today. And I think the more information that can be brought to bear about that, the better.
There's little to add other than to say that the very acronym,
Thanks.
Sister Leslie Baskerville, that you have over the years stood with and stood by and promoted, says, of course, there must be equal opportunity for our institutions. And that means funding. Of course it does. So my answer to your question is the same as Ruth Simmons. Yes. But of course, it takes more than saying such a thing, signing a petition. It takes systematic and persistent organizing to make this happen. It is my hope that in a new era that will begin in January, that the Biden-Harris leadership team will have a very strong very powerful and effective position and action on our HBCUs. How could I expect less when the sister vice president is a graduate of Howard University?
Thank you, Dr. Cole. I know a lot of people feeling that way. I'd like to bring in Bob Smith for the next question.
Yes, first of all, it's been a pleasure listening to you both, Dr. Simmons and Dr. Cole. This has really been inspiring for me, having looked at this history. But I have a very brief question, and one is, since society, particularly the judicial system, has cut off affirmative action as a relief for educating African Americans, the emphasis has shifted to providing African American kids with a good elementary education so they can be competitive, so we can have a strong pipeline of students going to both PWIs as well as HBCUs. What role, well, historically, HBCUs have played a major role in working with K-12 education historically. What role can HBCUs continue to play in assisting school districts and individual schools in strengthening their elementary school programs so that we can have this strong pipeline of students coming into higher education and being competitive?
Well, one of the things that has been a great misfortune of higher education in the last decades is the reduction of focus on schools of education and the trivialization in some ways of the profession in regard to other fields. And so the rise of STEM and other fields have in some ways caused people to discourage students from concentrating in fields leading to teaching, which is, and that is having a profound effect on society in general. So a steady commitment to resources for our schools of education and a steady encouragement of our brightest students to go into education is all important. We've recently endowed some scholarships for the best students to focus on going into teaching. We have a number of announcements coming that will make it easier for these students to feel that they can make a living if they choose that path. But in addition to that, we think that the policy direction is very important, and we recently took on work with the state legislature here in Texas to persuade them of what we think is the appropriate curriculum for students as they come through public education. And that, you won't surprise you, relates to educating them about their history, for example, earlier on, to make sure that they begin to have a sense of connection to that history and a sense of confidence about who they are, in addition to all the other things they're going to learn. So from the policy perspective, I think it's very important for our faculty to engage at the K through 12 level in terms of the curriculum, certainly. Also for our students to be in the schools, giving these young students examples of what they can do. And we spend an inordinate amount of effort bringing these young people to our campus. We want from the earliest time for them to be socialized to the idea that that's where they're headed. They're going on to college. And we think that that helps to motivate them in continuing with their education and enrolling in some of the prerequisite courses that they will need in order to study in some areas in college. So there's much that one can do. There's no one formula, in my view, that works, but you have to be engaged. It's simply too important.
Very quickly, only to say that our destinies are tied. There can be in the future no true success for HBCUs without true success in public school education. And we're at a point in our country now where there is more segregation in the public schools than ever before in some ways. It's done now by zip codes. It's done by who gets the resources for this school because it is situated in this particular neighborhood. And so the HBCU community certainly has to find more and more effective ways to be in genuine partnership with educating African-American children from K through 12 and on into higher ed.
Well said. Unfortunately, we are out of time. This is time well spent, of course. I want to thank, first of all, the committee for your enlightening questions, and thank you to Dr. Simmons, Dr. Cole, for your insights, your dedication, and your example that inspires us all in examining and improving the history of our education in the African-American community. We certainly hope that you'll reflect, all of you will reflect on today's presentation. It really is a call to action, underscoring the importance of preserving our rich history. I want to thank you all. Please be well.